please everyone meet Brandon. He's the founder, or Dr. Brandon Hermalyn. He's the founder and CEO of Thalo Labs, and he'll tell us all about the company. But in a nutshell, the mission is about building the next generation of building decarbonization solutions. And he's a former NASA scientist. Love the fact you made system for deployed on land, air, and space from Antarctica to the moon. So if people stay longer, we can ask you more questions about that because that sounds really, really fun. And before that, you were acquired by Google when you were at Skybook Imaging, some connection with my personal background in maps. You also work on Waymo's camera program, and you run the GM Cruises autonomous vehicle hardware program. So you can see a lot of hardware, software connections, and you'll be able to tell us more about that. So with that, I'm going to stop so we can just hear from you, Brandon. But I think this intro is already teasing, like you work from some amazing brands in very big and famous companies. So I'm curious to understand what, drove you to build Thalo Labs and just leave them and go on your own adventure.
Sounds great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to the community. I feel the Zoogler community has been pretty essential for us actually getting this kicked off. I think our first pre-seed check came out of the Zoogler Fund, and the second check was from one of the first investors at Google, and he was pretty excited. So I'm really excited to be part of this community and for all the good stuff that's coming out of it. I'll give a quick background on who I am and where how I got into this, because even the Google my Google Rumspringa was a point of cognitive dissonance for me. I never really expected to be part of that, because I'm an aerospace guy. I'm a physicist by training. Spent a lot of time working at NASA and defense organizations. We would make all sorts of cool things, that most of which actually would measure greenhouse gases. So these are cameras and telescopes and spectrometers, and we'd fly them on a bunch of spacecraft, some of which were looking at Earth, and a lot of which were not. They were looking at, for example, the moon or cometary material, of which there's a lot of greenhouse gases you can measure there. And put them on planes, did some stuff in the Arctic dry valleys looking for melt campaigns. All of it was very cool. I enjoyed it very much. But measuring greenhouse gases from space is kind of one of the most depressing things you can do in sustainability, because you can't touch it. Like, the best thing you can do is like send an email. It's like, still leaking, right? And that is somewhat frustrating if you want to go and actually go touch carbon. I feel like this is one step closer to software-only solutions in climate, where you can potentially advise how to fix stuff, but you don't get to actually touch the carbon itself. So, we went through my background a little bit in some of these other spaces. I've made a lot of combined hardware software systems. A lot of it has to do very heavy on sensing. And that kind of is the genesis of Thalo also, is when I was, I can tell the villain origin story. I was on some really delightful Zoom call at the beginning of the pandemic. And do you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were supposed to drop global greenhouse gas emissions? Like, this was going to be a big story, right? We're going to stop manufacturing in China. A lot of the travel was going to shut down. And it was supposed to be huge, 30, 40%, like a huge natural experiment. And I got some email from somebody who was working on a satellite we'd flown a while ago. And the subject was, I think we're screwed. And it was a preprint of the paper showing maybe 8%, maybe 9% that we dropped, which means the sources are wrong, the sinks are wrong, everything's kind of wrong in the model. And that, for me, actually just flipped the switch in my head, where all I really wanted to do was get back into the sustainability side of things. And I wanted to do it when you look at sustainability, right? I've been actively trying to say I don't work in climate, because I don't know what that even means, right? It's like saying I work on the internet. It's like, it's every single job is going to have a component of working in sustainability as time progresses. There's just so much to do, right? Like, you can focus on batteries, and you can focus on really cool, and you can focus on grid optimization, you can do waste management, you can do all sorts of things. The area that I found really uniquely interesting, and where I thought could have a very big impact, was working on what I consider the waste management side of carbon, which is, all of this emissions that is coming out. We really have very little idea of where it's coming from, and part of that reason is because it was kind of expensive to measure it. So I thought we could have a really interesting opportunity to bring down the cost and bring up the pervasiveness of measurement of greenhouse gases. And in so doing, that would allow us to do a much better job of managing them. And that has to work, though, in the context of the market that you attack, right? Because actually, we totally do this already in regulated markets, like energy and pipelines. Like there's regulation around all the leakage and how well even EPA, the Clean Air Act, requires power plants to measure what's coming out of them in real time with continuous emissions monitoring systems. And even if you go a couple of notches down, transportation is actually relatively regulated and is really pushed on to make sure that we don't have a lot of stuff coming out of our tailpipes. That's why it actually cleaned up the air dramatically. And then you look at the built environment, which is this in the worldwide aspect considered the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, which is just the operational part of heating and cooling all of our buildings. In places like New York City and most other major cities, it's not the second largest, it's super dominant. It's over 70% of the emissions in New York City last year came from heating and cooling our buildings, not from the cars on the road, not from agriculture, not from manufacturing, heating and cooling the buildings. And it's in terms of regulation, almost nothing. We have no real idea what's coming out. And the reason was, well, those systems on power plants, those can cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and require people to look at them. And that investment just hasn't been made for the built environment. So that's kind of where we wanted to land, is if you can make it cheaper to measure all these emissions coming out of the built environment, this really unlocks this new capability of knowing not just what's coming out, but also how can you save people money in so doing it, right? And that's the genesis for Thalo. So I'll pause there since I hope.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I want to go back to this moment, like during pandemic, you have that realization, you have all the skills coming from your background in hardware and sensors. Can you tell us the next step? Like, how did you decide? How did you build the first team or even the first prototype of your solution?
Yeah. And of course, starting a new company is, terrifying and hard, right? Like it is. And if anybody tells you otherwise, they're either, well, I don't know. It's terrifying and hard, especially in the middle of a pandemic. The first ones of these I made in my kitchen, like in the middle of the pandemic. Like our prototypes were all made in Tupperware and like just get it going and see if it actually works. The team, particularly, I don't know if this is as relevant anymore, but we started the company in 2021, and everybody was remote, and it's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to do hardware in general remote. It's super hard to start, right? Because all of that high bandwidth communication goes away, and then it's just you're functioning at a larger scale, which has, I think, just less creativity. So the starting team I had really were people who I'd worked with before, who were all remote and were excited to get started. I've had the luxury of and the privilege of building pretty large engineering organizations previously at more or less all the places I'd been at. So I was able to tap into that network. Once everybody started getting more in person, we focused. So I was actually out in the California Bay Area Google offices when we got acquired at Skybox got acquired. I moved it back to New York. I'm from New York originally. Moved back here for a variety of reasons, not just the beautiful people and the beautiful pizzas, but also because we have one of the most aggressive emissions laws on the books for buildings. We have something called Local Law 97, which is going to start fining buildings if they emit too much starting this year. That was actually a huge challenge because moving back to New York, I didn't have that network. And one of the main areas I tried to pull that network from was the Zoogler community, of course. So yeah, it's very challenging to build out teams de novo, and I don't think that the pandemic helped, but
Yeah.
hopefully it's getting better and better as time progresses.
Well, I encourage everybody to look at the video on Brendan's website where you can see some of the module, and they're definitely not made of Tupperware. So it's really cool. I didn't know that origin story where you started. And yeah, I think if you hear Third Sphere, they say about 60% of climate projects are hardware-based projects. So it's a big part, and it's also a shift how we think about the funding. Can you touch a little bit also how you thought about the fundraising at the beginning of the company, or if there's anything you can share about your plans right now?
Yeah,
Capital.
and it's very much a function of time, right? So starting a company in 2021, if you remember, zero interest rates, and everybody was really excited about climate. There was a lot of money getting dumped in from, I think we're calling them the climate tourists, who were, wanted to be part of this space, and maybe were working in another fund and they moved it over. So certainly, and in 2021, if you rewind, we didn't have the sort of federal incentives that we actually have now, or even the state incentives. We didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act or the Farm Act or any of these other like relatively chunky amounts of non-dilutive capital available. And with zero interest rates, you couldn't get loans very easily. You could do venture debt, but that's unpleasant on a variety of levels. So we started the company really assuming we were going to do the semi-standard venture capital fueled growth path, which is, for the last, I'm sure everyone on this call like knows kind of what that treadmill looks like. As time has progressed, we've really tried to pivot as fast as possible more towards the profitability side, because venture has definitely, particularly around climate in this current ecosystem, it's dried up dramatically. I don't know if everyone's been following it, like, for example, on the CTVC, the Climate Tech venture capital list. I think it's called Sightline Climate now. They track this pretty well. And there's been a pretty precipitous pullback. The way we think about it is the larger we can be, the better of a climate company, because you need to touch a lot of emissions. And by definition, doing something that's sort of small and bespoke doesn't actually answer the mail on trying to touch every tailpipe in the world. So when we started, the venture was a really good model for it. I think that as time has progressed, that capital stack has changed pretty dramatically.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we all watch some of those numbers, and hopefully we're going to go back up on the right trend, because it's really critical. Maybe I think for this group, it would be helpful if you can get a little bit into more details about what the solution, how it works,
Sure.
how the design evolved, and if you even had to pivot the design of the platform over time as you got more feedback, without understanding how you capture feedback also for users, no pun intended. Can you talk a bit through that?
Yeah, let's do the tech, and then maybe we'll talk about the vector changes as time has progressed. So we have kind of a couple of core pieces of technology we've developed. I consider us a hard tech climate startup. Like that's what we do. And if this existed before, then we wouldn't have to build all of it. The main fundamental for most of it comes down to a really, really accurate sensing system. And a lot of it has been enabled by relatively recent advances in photonics, some of which were enabled by all the LiDAR boom from a few years ago and self-driving. But all those like photonic sensors now are nice, like super cheap but quite accurate. It's also been enabled very much by onboard compute, where we couldn't do some of the spectral deconvolution easily before. Now it's like we just do it. It's like relatively straightforward. Obviously, we have a lot of IP in that, but you can do it now. And of course, the backhaul into cloud has actually gotten really, really cheap, which is great. And those three things combined basically means that we could make spectrometers that 10, 15 years ago could have been millions of dollars, now for very, very cheap, sub $1,000, even less at low quantities. That has allowed us to get into places where it would make no sense to measure your exhaust before, but now suddenly it's like, oh, this actually really helps a lot. On the tech front, we really started actually with doing carbon capture in the built environment. We think that we have one of the best, this is another core piece of our IP, is we think we have one of the best, most efficient carbon capture technologies and deployments on the face of the earth. Partially because we're advantaged. I'm just a silly physicist, so I just like efficiencies. So because we deploy in buildings, someone built my facility. It's the city. So I just have to add boxes to it, which is very, very capital efficient. But it's also really carbon efficient. Indoor air is a multiple on top of the CO2 that you'd find outdoors, is much, much higher inside. And this allows it to be energetically very, very much more easily captured. The genesis of that sensor that we put everywhere actually was originally designed to capture in real time how much CO2 we were taking up. And we wanted to do this. I was very frustrated by how everybody was like sort of estimating it, or like, oh, I'll weigh this stuff. It's like, that's not how you do it. You like, let's do it for real. Just every time I took that sensor and I would put it on other pieces of stuff in the buildings, I'd be like, holy moly, this stuff is all leaking. And it's all operating incorrectly. We put it on boilers. Like every time we did it, we're finding natural gas leaks. And like, this is awful. We put it on refrigerant systems and we're like, this is also leaking refrigerant. This is really, really awful. So that speaks a little bit also to the way we have sort of tried to find our path. When we started, it was very much around the gestalt of the moment was carbon capture, and how do we do as much of it as largely and everywhere as possible. And it's just that carbon capture costs money. And what we were able to find is a different avenue in where if you do a better job on your emissions, you're probably going to save a lot of money. And the operational costs intended of being able to know what's actually happening in your built environment are very, very compelling. It also, frankly, is a much better lever arm, because I don't know how to capture enough carbon to deal with a bent pipe leaking natural gas or refrigerant. It just, the GHG component of that is so dominant that like step one, phase one of this has to be that we reduce the total amount of emissions coming out of our buildings. And then we can start talking about how to get to net negative. But you got to do it kind of in that order. I'm sorry if I'm jumping onto the next part, but you were asking a little bit about how we've done this discovery and tried to learn. And it's been challenging because the things people have been asking for have literally changed in the last three plus years. We've only been in business 3 years. ESG and sustainability was like, that was the product to start, which was great for us because we didn't know how much money we could save people, right? So selling a product that really tapped into an ESG market was compelling. Within the last 3 years, we've watched a very significant pullback of ESG spending. A lot of the larger companies totally missed their emissions goals this year, and they were basically not punished by the stock market. That signal has been heard loud and clearly by those large companies. So now we've really moved ourselves over into the more energy efficiency and operational improvements. It doesn't change what we do. We actually are still saving a huge amount of emissions, but the positioning has definitely changed very dramatically in the last year or two.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And again, using the chat, if some other people are in this industry and have other analysis or feedback, would love to hear if it's been the same analysis for other people. And maybe I was curious, so this feedback from the field, how is it happening? Is it you talking to a lot of building owners? How do you structure even this part of the go-to-market to some extent?
A lot of this has been indeed the me talking to people, right? Like the founder-led sales is exactly what you need, especially when you're talking to these, sustainability type managers. So, everybody will probably tell you that selling into real estate is really hard, and they're 100% correct. It is a total pain, right? Because there's a lot of different stakeholders and they don't all look the same. Even two buildings, they can have totally different management structures. Our way of getting into this has been, you have to kind of have this stair-step pattern of like your first customers are probably not your second customers because they may not be scalable, but you learn a lot. So like real estate investment trusts, they manage their own buildings. They have ESG goals. They also have gotten hit some of the hardest in terms of occupancy. So like their bottom line hurts pretty badly. That's an easier sell, not because it's easier, but because there's less people to convince. And then as you move on to more like managed buildings and others, then you tend to learn quite a bit. But yeah, it's an incredibly interesting and fragmented market. And the main byline for all of it is finding the pain point that exists kind of in a fractal level throughout the organization. So, which really translates, we found mostly to operational pain. So the top level concerns about operational pain means like people won't stay in the building or, will leave you. And at the bottom level of like the actual building engineers trying to own and operate these things, they're like really suffering because they're playing whack-a-mole with less and less resources every year and usually more and more buildings as people retire and others. So yeah, that feedback, it's hard to get, but it's exactly as manual as you'd expect. I think this is actually why a lot of companies that try to get into the space, particularly if they're coming from larger companies, like you just got to go do it. You got to go talk. Like I walk into buildings frequently and just like, hey, where's the chief engineer? Can I talk to you? And that sort of manual work like totally works. Email campaigns don't work. The call that just never works. Phone calls sometimes work. But it's an incredibly manual business until you get to some sort of tipping point, which hopefully we'll get to sooner than later.
I think it's fascinating. We heard the same in our first session, actually, of the School and Climate with Cynthia, who's selling to arborists, and she's literally walking the fields to meet our audience. So I think it's a good lesson for many of us who work in big tech or small tech, and every go-to-market is slightly different. I was also curious, I saw you had incredible press coverage from the New York Times to AD Magazine and Reuters. Like, how did that happen? Is it an area you're focusing on, doing a lot of PR? Or, yeah, if you can share.
No, honestly, I think one of the areas that we've done the least amount and probably should do more in has been marketing and press like that. I think we just got pretty lucky that we were in the right place at the right time for some of those pieces of coverage. New York Times, for example, that was very much, we're based here in the Brooklyn Navy Yards, which is so New York, for whatever reason, I'm from here, right? I have no real idea why we're the foremost group in terms of like building decarbonization. I'm super excited about it, but like there's a really large number of companies that are based in and around New York that are working on different solutions, likely because Local 197, this carbon fine structure, but also like one of the investors very early on they didn't invest. And they were like, I'm concerned you're going to get stuck in the New York market. And I was like, you should be really happy if I get stuck here. This is a really good market. There's a million buildings in New York. Literally, there's a million structures in New York City. Great place to get stuck to start. So that the reason we got that press is because there was a significant amount of overpressure on like, hey, this is really cool. There's a bunch of companies starting all in the same space, and we just happen to be in the right place, right time. Maybe I should ask you how I should be doing better in terms of that marketing.
Oh, that's always an interesting one, but we can take that offline
Right.
anytime. But yeah, I think the biggest question for me is, especially when you bring a differentiated solution, is how you start building trust, right? You say, I think it's wonderful if you have momentum and other companies in the same space, but I'm sure selling to those real estate companies is not easy. Did you find things that are really important for them as you build trust about the technology, the vision? And you mentioned your manifesto. I would love also to hear more, like how all these things create a vision, and yeah, how you get people along in that vision.
Yeah. The trust thing, particularly in real estate, I love these guys and I love buildings and I love New York. They are not on the cutting edge of technology. The early adaptation in real estate is incredibly late for everybody else. So everybody wants to be first when someone else has de-risked it, and not just like in abstract, like on a building that looks like mine in the same area with the same stuff is like, well, it's like, oh, we have this one. It's like, yeah, but that's not the same one as mine. It's like, but it's the same thing. Like, what's the difference? You have to be like actually in the same sort of ecosystem. This actually happened in sort of the opposite order to get that initial install for us. I thought we were going to go after like little guys, like little small buildings. We find like some way to get in, and you work your way up to the Class A. And for whatever reason, Class A, like top Fortune 50 type companies, were willing to take the chance. And so like our first contract was with a Fortune 50 bank, which was terrifying because it's huge.
Wow.
And we had to sort of grow up pretty quickly, or at least look like we grew up pretty quickly externally. So those guys were the ones that were actually willing to take the chance and do the first one. And that is kind of how that enabled. And hilariously, we've moved in some ways down market from those initial installations. So like we found really good. Empire State Building is one of our largest deployments. They've announced us in their ESG report. Vornado is a great REIT. They've been very public announcing us. We've signed master services agreement with these larger real estate management firms, which has allowed us to scale. But yeah, getting that first installation is really, really hard. And this is really dumb. I also thought we were going to go into like the nonprofit area. So like we're in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, that's operated as a nonprofit. I was like, oh, great. We have a bunch of buildings here we can deploy. The paperwork to try and get that signed took so long that we actually like looped them with commercial buildings, which was very surprising to me. But that was like so painful to get all that because the risk aversion is not aligned, right? Like it's much easier to just say no and not suffer the risk. Where I think the commercial sector was like, all right, well, like we got to do something, so let's try this. The manifesto is a little bit different. So it has a lot less to do with the commercialization, a lot more to do with a gentle amount of megalomania that I have in terms of trying to reduce the total amount of emissions coming out of the built environment. In this, I've slightly stolen this from the Elon Tesla manifesto. So if it sounds like that, it's because I stole a little bit of it. But I think the framing is actually really helpful. So the first step of this has to be, if you can find it's like the 80-20 problem. If you can find the worst emitters in the built environment and fix them, that has a really unholy lever arm in terms of reducing the emissions coming out of buildings. And that's our first step, is how do we find the worst ones and fix them? We've been attacking that through going after cogen facilities, large boilers, the refrigerant-based systems. And to date, we've actually already remediated over 80,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And that's like kind of wild for a company of our size. Like that's larger than most like climate investment portfolios have done in total. And we're on pace to at least 10x that in the next year, which is really exciting for us. The second part is, now that you've done that, how do you go and sense everything, right? How do you get all that long tail? And the only way you do that is by making really cheap systems that you can deploy everywhere and make it so that it can save people money and pain. The third step is, now you suddenly have the best data set on planet Earth, right? You know exactly how all these systems are operating. You know what to do. You can even like do load balancing. You understand all this stuff. So how do you take that data and accelerate the transition to a not just fully electric ecosystem, but also one that is not leaking, right? Because you can't have an HVAC system that is leaking refrigerant. That's not a net zero building. That's just a pain. And once you've done that, once you've gotten to net zero and accelerated that transition, our goal is to scale the ability to do carbon capture in the built environment, to turn our cities, our buildings into net carbon sinks within the next decade. And that's the manifesto. And it kind of has to happen in that order, though, because as I said before, is like, if you start doing a bunch of capture when you're leaking natural gas or when you're leaking refrigerant, there's no point. And if you do it in this order, it actually also aligns your incentives pretty well, because guess what? When it's like 70% of the boilers we look at are just leaking natural gas. It's like total waste. So honest, like 50+% of heat pumps that we look at, particularly the modular ones. Remember, a new heat pump, you think, oh, it's not going to leak. They're assembled on site with building techs, and like they have to hand crimp the lines. Even the newest heat pump that you install has a 1 in 2 chance of just leaking within the first year. And that whole time, not only is it leaking refrigerant, but it's also really inefficient, because you're burning, it's the hardest working compressor in show business as it leaks, right? So that first order is where we're really highly focused right now, because it can save people so much. We usually are seeing like up to 15 to 20+% savings just in your bills. And that doesn't even include the emissions part of it. So that's the manifesto. It's like, let's go start with this. This is like not even low hanging fruit. It's fruit that's on the floor. All you need to do is make a system that you can actually go and find that fruit. So we're in the fruit finding business right now.
I love that. I think the clarity of the vision is so compelling and so clear for people to understand. I just have a question about your first step, because does that mean you need to have a lot of people on the ground who have the skills to repair, and is there enough actually like resources on the ground to do that?
This is a great question. I mean, in general, I think the answer is no. Globally, I don't think that we have. We're about to do something that took us a couple 100 years to build, is like a largely petrochemical based infrastructure. And we're going to try and change it in like 15, 20 years. And we have not really been investing in developing the workforce and labor to do it. Actually, quite the opposite. When I walk into buildings, a lot of times that chief engineer is real close to retirement, and there's not a lot of people coming to support it from underneath. And you can tell that they're close to retirement because they'll tell you over and over again that they're just a couple more years. So I actually often think that the second part of what we need to do within the tech space is, whenever you can find these industries that are not as tech enabled as they could be, right? Like the fact that we have no instrumentation, we have no check engine light on any of these buildings is insane. We could totally do it, right? It's insanity. Once you think about it in that sense, you can start to enable the smaller labor resources to actually be much more efficient, right? Right now, if your leak detector is your tenant calling you and saying it's hot in this room, it's too late, right? We can't support that. If you can instrument the entire built environment with lightweight instrumentation, but instrument it, then you don't have to get that call ever. You can actually be much more prognostic. You can be much more active in addressing it. So we ourselves, I don't see a immediate path to spending a lot of time in terms of building out that operational effect. What we have done is we've been partnering with, the larger real estate management firms to actually be the boots on the ground. And also like HVAC technicians and those sort of groups. So they love this, billable hours, right? And it's also, very aligned with what they're selling to their customers, which is, we're going to take care of this problem for you. So that's how we've been leveraging the sort of labor to start. It's a huge problem. I actually don't exactly know. I don't think anyone has a great idea of how we're going to solve this globally, but certainly one of the first ways to do it is just make all the people we're working with much more efficient.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's a great point. I want to stay on the topic of skills actually, because I know and sometime in our community we have brand new people and they're wondering how to make the transition or which skills are the most transferable. Do you need to go through a very formal program about climate tech? And I really love your intro comment. I think I'm thinking a lot about that too. Even the term climate tech is so broad. People don't self-identify. So what would be a recommendation for people who haven't really jumped yet to the climate sectors, whatever they are, and which skills, if you look at your team today, like how many scientists versus people who come from a tech background would have a big impact in your team specifically?
Yes. Yeah, this is particularly for the Zoogler community, right? Like there is a potential bias towards obviously software and product program management, and within small companies doing hardware type stuff. That is like I think of our company as a hardware enabled company, but there's also a lot of software, right? So I mean, we do a lot of all of this processing that we're doing in the cloud is like super relevant. I do think that we have like kind of an interesting problem. Sorry, I'm going slightly off script, but I'm interested in this because we have a lot of really excellent people who could crunch a lot of data, and we actually are missing the data, right? When we talk about like emissions data, that's usually your bill. Like that's that's like a hangover, right? It's like what happened last week? Oh my God. And then that's incredibly unactionable, except in hindsight. So I find this really fascinating because we have like some of the sharpest people on the planet, and we're not feeding them the right data because we've just never really optimized for getting that data set. So I'm interested in the next couple of years, like as some of this becomes more actionable, like how we can action that. We mostly hire right now hardware people. We hire a lot of people who have electrical engineering, mechanical engineering. That's a core component to what we do. Within the software realm, we have a number of people who are much more infrastructure based, right? So we don't use IoT anymore because that's an incredibly dirty acronym for our investor friends. So we cloud based though, which is fine. We have a lot of firmware also, which I think is an underappreciated combination of hardware and software. So we do a lot of this on device. That's how we're actually running a bunch of ML models right on device for spectral deconvolution, which is like a super great use of ML, but that's usually not thought of as much. Right now, our biggest push in terms of hiring actually is in building out the business development section of this, which is how do you sell climate solutions to people who really don't want to pay for stuff, right? Like this is a hard thing we're asking. So I actually think that we as climate and sustainability people are missing opportunities to do it from a data-driven standpoint, where you can show, like we spend a lot of time developing return on ROI tools. So when we talk to anybody, it's like, hey, like, yeah, I know you don't want this, and I know you don't like Joe Biden. That's not my problem. It's like, I think this can save you money. Drew, this is a good question. Do you want to answer? Shall I answer this in real time, or at the end?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's
only if you want
to. Yeah, building BMS, so building management systems integrations. There's about 1 million companies trying to do software scraping of BMS integrations. Some of them work. A lot of times what they're doing is they're operating the devices differently. which is useful, right? Like you take a weather forecast, you look at occupancy data, you look across the thing. There's a company here called Griddium, does a really nice job on a lot of that. There's a bunch of others as well. I actually do feel that unfortunately we are missing some information, because if we were able to do all this stuff right now, we would. But those like never measure the CO2 coming out. None of them are measuring natural gas leaks. Even like the refrigerant requirements, those are all driven by some early failures where the refrigerant, of course, is not necessarily toxic, but it's heavier than air and people would suffocate, right, as it leaked in data centers or other places. So those are very bulk measurements of like, is this a safety problem? Not, is this an emissions problem? So I do think that getting that granular data is going to be one of the unsolved problems. That's really one of the things we're trying to do, right? Is how do you make it so easy and cheap to get that data that it makes business sense? And I think that that's going to be driven, at least in the real estate sector, and I think in other sectors, by some of this cool new tech, right? Like we really couldn't do this 5 to 10 years ago, and now we can. So let's go do it.
Thank you. And don't be shy. If you have other questions, we'll monitor the chat and make sure Brendan can see them. I want to keep some time actually for open question, but you mentioned the manifesto, so it feels like a very long-term vision of the company, and that's awesome. Two things I'm curious about is what's your own version of success? Like for you personally, what does success look like? And if everything goes well, where are you going to be in 2026? In
2026.
ideal world.
So the metric I track is the total tons of CO2 equivalent that we've touched. That is the North Star that I'm most interested in. It's not deployments, it's not money. It's like we should touch the largest amount possible. And that's one of the things that gets me so excited about this company is I feel like we're touching the last like unregulated market. And I feel because everybody else is working on it on larger sectors, this one feels like it's so ripe for someone to just put your dirty hands around dirty boilers and things. It's just like nice and hard and unsexy. And I love that because I had this joke the other day. Somebody said, I've never seen so many PhDs in the boiler room. And I was like, great. Like, that's what we should be there. Like, that's where everybody should be working, is trying to figure out how to decarbonize stuff. So success for me in the next year is we have our internal plot. I want it of tons of CO2 equivalent. I want that internal plot external on the website, and I want it to be in millions of tons. And I think that we have a really clear chance of doing that in a very, very short amount of time. For 2026, so right now we're a 3-year-old company. I can't tell if that's a long time or a short time, maybe both. 2026 is just a couple of years away, right? There's a lot of cool stuff that should be happening between now and then. While New York has been the first for Local Law 97, there's a number of other municipalities that are coming online with nearly identical legislation. Boston, for example, like many younger, more annoying siblings, has cut and pasted Local Law 97 and has a version of that called Birdo 2.0 coming into play in the next year or two. There's something like 10, 15 other legislations that are in pipeline. I'd like to see Thalo across. We are 9 states now. I'd like to be installed in every state in the US, and I'd definitely like to start expanding into Europe if possible. I'd like to come back to that metric number of millions of tons. Like, I think the fastest path to megaton reduction of CO2 equivalent in the world isn't through the removal of carbon. It has to be in the reduction of carbon. And that for me is that North Star, is how do we start, like, let's just stop fooling around and stop emitting. Like, that has to be our biggest push. And you can stop emitting by stop burning. That's great. But there's that phase 0 where, holy crap, all this stuff is leaking. That's just like an unforced error. And that can be solved, I think, pretty immediately. So 2026, I'd like to see every state, bunch of stuff in Europe. I'd like us to be in the multiple millions of tons of CO2 equivalent reduced. And then I'd like to be doing, I think, realistically small but exciting amounts of capture to show that path of getting us not just to net 0, but to net negative.
That seems like a big roadmap in front of you, but I love the vision. Thank you. So just wrapping up, again, for this community, I want to hear what your recommendations are. If, again, we talked a little bit about the tools to get there. Anything that was helpful for you, or any resources that you would really encourage people to check out to better understand your space, or just get even more aware of some of the metrics we discussed today?
Climate is it's a daunting subject to jump into, right? There's all these new terms and jargon, and I've liked Project Drawdown. I think is a really good resource for getting sort of a primer on sort of some of the areas that are interesting. I definitely would sign up to a few of the mailing lists. So there's the Climate Tech VC is one of my favorites. Full disclosure, that's also one of my investors. So I'll have to, whenever they do a really nice job of sort of breaking down where some of the money is flowing, which is a good indicator of where there's exciting places. I do recommend if you're going to start something, go to somewhere where the money is not yet flowing, because it changes course very, very quickly. The My Climate Journey podcast, that's pretty good to listen to. They have a very, very active community in Slack. There's a Zugler run Distributed Energy Resources, DER, I think. And there's also Work on Climate that is run by Zuglers. Really good Slack groups, a lot of connections in there. I think, the thing I think of a lot is, like, if you say I want to work on climate, what do I do? That's really hard. I think that there's so many opportunities that you should pick a sector that you want to work in. Do you want to work in cars? Do you want to work on buildings? Do you want to work on agriculture? Pick the thing that you're like kind of amped about, and then find a solution where you can make differences. Because we're like, this is like a bad improv class. Yes, and every single thing we can possibly do, every single sector has significant room for decarbonization. So, like, there's no trying to pick only the biggest. That is that's not necessary. Like, every single sector can improve. So I like buildings. I like city stuff. I'm from here. That's one of the reasons I like doing this. Like, it's really fun to go in. I was in the basement of the Empire State Building last week, putting stuff all over their chiller plants. It's like really freaking cool. I like it. Find something where, find that sector that you're like amped about, and then find a pathway to decarbonize it. And I think that that's a much easier question to answer than, I want to work in climate. What are all the opportunities? What are all the things, right? So I bet that most of you don't get excited about emissions tracking or regulations. Like, so even though that is like the most obvious thing to do from a potential software jump, don't do that. Find a thing that you want to go work in, and there's room to decarbonize everything.
I really like the MCG approach to their portfolio. Is it like, do you want to move atoms? Do you want to move bits? And then it's already your first categorization, how physical you want to be versus how more digital you want to be in your next step in climate. So again, we have all this list in the resources. I'll add some of yours, which I don't think we have. So thank you for sharing. And I wanted to close and asking like how this community can be helpful to you.
Well, that's a great question. I feel like the Zugler community has already given us so much, which is wonderful. We're always looking for the three things that every small company is looking for: customers. So if you know somebody or a company that is looking for help in decarbonizing these sort of sectors, we'd love to chat with them, even if it's just a chat. We're always fundraising. So if you or know somebody who is interested in getting in the space, particularly those who are more aligned with that, pure climate fundraising is probably not the only way to go. We would love to find more insiders who are really deeply connected with portfolios. And then we're always hiring, which is a good problem to have. So if you are interested in this, or you can see someone on our job board who would be a great fit for anything that we're looking at, we'd love to talk with you.
Wonderful. How big is the team right now?
We're at 13. And mostly right now focuses on BD, which is a really great problem to have. We can't currently deal with all of our inbound, which is a problem, but great problem. So it turns out if you can save people a bunch of money, they actually like it.
Well, we'll make sure to get the community to know about that and send you some good candidates, hopefully. And yeah, if you have a script to help us figure out the right clients too, I'm happy to help. But again, thank you so much for such a great educational session, and really love hearing your vision. I think this manifesto you shared with us is really reassuring in terms of we're not solving for today. We have a long-term vision, And this is exciting. I think personally, I'm not working in the building every day, but I get so excited about your vision. So thank you for making the time. And I want to open up, as we say, we have a few more minutes. So people who are on camera, if you have a comment or questions or something, just click with you.
Brandon, thanks. This is great. I love some of your go-to-market. It sounds like you just walked into buildings and you were like, who's the person that I need to talk to about this? That's cool. And they can't ignore that email for sure. But I just emailed somebody for the fourth time. They now just got back to me. It's like, oh, it's funny. Why did you just respond now? Anyway, have you done any like partnerships or kind of have you gone through like a distribution method with like PE funds that invest in commercial real estate or anything like that?
No, this is a great question. You've probably just saw the Wall Street Journal thing where like this week, I don't know if everyone saw this, they were sort of outing the fact that PE firms have been doing this HVAC service group roll up for a few years, where like everybody retires, they'll buy a few of them, clump them, sell them to another PE group, more clumping. We have not yet done that type of partnership. I would love if anyone has contacts within those PE firms that are doing it. We feel like there's a very specific value add for that, because like if you have a dashboard, which we do, of all the assets someone is managing, and you can tell which ones are operating efficiently, which ones are breaking, which ones are fine or have been fixed or not fixed correctly, suddenly that becomes very, very effective. And that's kind of like my random vision is like, how do I get like the dashboard for everything that is emitting in the built environment? And then what can you do to help accelerate that drawdown? The HVAC version of that is like, I can roll trucks a lot less and I can be very efficient and like, oh, I know what's broken. So that's in the truck. You don't have 3 rolls. And if I fixed it, I can verify it actually is working, which is actually harder than you think. So we haven't done those sort of partnerships yet. Would love to.
And yeah, cutting costs sounds like PE firms' favorite thing to do. So
yeah, that's yeah, true statement.
Well, UK market is ready for you.
Brendan, thank you so much. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and your time especially. It was a wonderful session. Again, thank you. And I hope I'll see everyone in 2 weeks for our next episode. Have a great day,
Thank you so much for the
everyone.
opportunity and setting
Thank
this up.
you.
This is really wonderful to have this community. Thank you.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Brendan. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.